This is not a simple life, my friends, and there are no simple answers. These words, the late editor of the Miami News, Bill Baggs, would stamp on postcards and send out to the readers who sent him hate mail. This happened often, by the way, because Bill, as editor, tended to promote ideas that weren't popular at the time. For instance, in his front page daily column, he would talk about protecting the environment. He would talk about desegregating public schools. And he would talk about peace in Vietnam. Under his leadership, the Miami News earned 3 Pulitzer Prizes. Bill earned a bullet hole through his office window, plainclothes police guards standing outside of his home, and an old Mercedes outfitted with a remote starter so that if it had been rigged with a bomb, it would blow up before he got in it. In spite of his accomplishments and his causes, when Bill died at the age of 46 from pneumonia in 1969, his story nearly died with him. And that would have been a tragedy, because Bill has so much to teach us about how to find the answers to those not so simple questions. Like, how do we live in peace with one another? I first discovered Bill here at the beautiful tip of Key Biscayne. It's called Bill Baggs Cape Florida State Park in Miami. That historic lighthouse led ships through Biscayne Bay. Later on, it became a landmark for enslaved Africans escaping along the Underground Railroad to freedom in the Caribbean. In 2004, when I was working on a Biscayne Bay public access plan, I learned so much more about what Bill did to save this place, from advocating for in his column for finding the funding, for negotiating the purchase price. He wrote, "People need roads and bridges and places to work and live. Of course they do, but people need parks. They need places to rest and recline, to walk quietly, to dock a small boat, to listen to the soft drawl of the sea." These words became my landmark as I wrote the plan. And for years, this place became my respite, a place where I could go to renew my flagging spirits, because what Bill and I learned across the decades is that saving land in Florida was never simple. A couple of years later, I had taken a seat in this creative writing class, and I took a seat near a little old lady, and we started talking about the projects we were working on, what we wanted to write about. And she mentioned that she really wanted to write about her husband. Her name was Freck Baggs. That's the nickname Bill gave her, and she was known by because of the freckles across her nose. For the next year, Freck and I would meet once a week. She needed a sounding board for what would become her self-published memoir, and I got to, indulge my curiosity and learned so much more about how this son of Colquitt, Georgia, ultimately took on the world. And now I'm in this amazing and humbling space, not by birthright or by inheritance, but by being in the right place at the right time to share his story. And also, I want to carry on his unfinished work. One thing that Freck confided in me, that Bill had confided in her, was that at the age of 9, he witnessed a lynching. And the next day, the white murderers were passing the plate at church. I have absolutely no idea what that does to someone's soul. But what I learned about Bill as I studied his writings is that from that moment on, for him, religion and righteousness were not equal, and authority would always be questioned. At the age of 19, he volunteered for the U.S. Army Air Force and served as a bombardier and a B-24 Liberator over Europe. In his letters home, you get a sense of that widening perspective he was developing while he was laying in the belly of that beast. In one of those letters, dated July 28th, 1944, he wrote, "One thing is certain, war must be stopped. There's only one good that can come from this conflict, and that is a deeper and fuller appreciation of peace." After flying 50 missions and sustaining multiple injuries, he was sent to Miami for R&R, and there he said, "This is where I want to be a newspaperman." And he also dedicated his entire profession to that deeper, fuller appreciation of peace. As a reporter, he lifted up the voices of those marginalized by prejudice. As an editor, he befriended the powerful, like Senator Robert Kennedy, and nudged them along that arc toward justice. As a community leader, he would suffer the slings and arrows of his detractors and his friends, and he worked really hard not to stop an argument just to prove that he was right. And sometimes he won over hearts and minds. One of those hearts belonged to the Reverend Theodore Gibson, seen here with the white collar, the first time he was able to sit in the front of a bus. By the time that they met, by his own admission, Reverend Gibson had grown so filled with hatred and had lost so much faith in his fellow man that he said it burned like acid, and he felt he had no right to wear the cloth. But when he met Bill, together, they served on the Community Relations Board that eventually desegregated Miami's public schools. Bill would hold in trust the negotiated settlement between the NAACP and the local department stores, which opened up the lunch counters and the restrooms to Black patrons 2 years before the Civil Rights Act passed. And these two men entered into a secret pact, unbeknownst even to their families, that they would not leave the South until the South lived up to America's highest ideals. And they wanted to vanquish the stain of racism together. "He restored my faith," the Reverend would later say of Bill, and he returned that favor to Bill. Bill made 2 trips to North Vietnam as a writer. The first, in 1967, was to interview Ho Chi Minh. He was the last American journalist to do so. The second time, in 1968, was when he returned to help lay the groundwork for the Paris peace talks and to assess the state of the war. As the American bombers were bearing down, he awoke his colleague, Harry Ashmore, and said, "Come with me." And they walked down to a deserted Buddhist temple. There, Bill knelt and delivered an Episcopalian liturgy. By that afternoon, said Harry Ashmore, the bombing had ceased. 1968 was a terribly tumultuous year, and it was a time when the tide was violently turning against the Johnson administration. Bill also had grown concerned and decided to write his friend Robert Kennedy a letter encouraging him to get into the race. "If you do not make your views known now, you will lose whenever you choose to run." A month later, Kennedy entered the race. 2 weeks later, while Bill was still in Vietnam, Johnson stunned the world by saying he was not going to run again. Now, I don't know if Bill's letter had any sway on the senator, but I do know silence did not truck with Bill Baggs. He used the bully pulpit of his column to state very clearly what he was for and what he was against. And he was very clear that a paper wasn't even worth printing if you were seeking to be popular. And for that, he was called a commie, a pinko, a traitor, this decorated World War II veteran. But he suffered it, and he bore it with great humor. As one of his colleagues said, he would never use a broadaxe if a scalpel nick would do. And he confounded his enemies because they figured he rather loved them. And so Bill would stamp those postcards and send them out one by one. This is not a simple life, my friend, and there are no simple answers. And his words are just as relevant today as they were then. He is proof that our lives do not end that our stories don't end when our lives do. So let's do something here today. You and I, let's make a pact together that we will not leave this place until we live up to our highest ideals. Thank you.